I want to tell you about the third day on the Shawnee Trail, because the third day is the one that changed something in me permanently, and I want to tell it the way it happened rather than the way I have told it to myself in the months since, which is with a great deal of rationalization layered over the core facts. The core facts are simple, and I am going to give them to you plainly, and let you sit with them the way I have been sitting with them, which is without resolution and without the comfort of an explanation that holds up under pressure. I have been backpacking since I was 19 years old. I am now 37, and I have logged more nights in the backcountry than I could count accurately. Solo trips, group trips, weekends and week-long loops, and the occasional extended journey that stretches into 3 weeks of consecutive trail time. I mention this not to establish credentials, but to establish baseline. I know what the forest sounds like. I know the difference between the sounds an animal makes moving through brush and the sounds the wind makes, and the sounds a large forest produces, simply by being a large forest full of living things, doing what living things do. I have been in situations that frightened me. A bear encounter in the Smokies years ago, a night in a lightning storm on an exposed ridge in the Adirondacks, where I was genuinely uncertain whether I would make it to morning, and I know what my body does when it is afraid. The specific physiological signatures of real fear, as opposed to the ambient unease that remote places sometimes produce. What I felt on the third day of the Shawnee Loop was real fear, the kind that does not leave when the situation that caused it resolves. The Shawnee National Forest sits in the southern tip of Illinois, in a part of the state that most people do not think of when they think of Illinois, because most people think of Illinois as flat and agricultural, and the Shawnee is neither of those things. It is hilly and forested, and in places genuinely rugged, with sandstone bluffs and dense second-growth woodland, and the specific quality of isolation that a forest produces when it is large enough and the trail density is low enough that you can spend a full day without seeing another person. I had done the trail twice before, a 5-day loop that I had chosen originally because it was within driving distance of my home, and because the second-growth forest had a character I found compelling. Not the ancient cathedral quality of old growth, but the denser, more tangled quality of forest that is still in the process of becoming itself. The undergrowth thick and the tree canopy varied, and the trail in places more of a suggestion than a clear corridor. I liked the Shawnee. I felt comfortable in the Shawnee. I had no reason on the first and second days of that third trip to feel anything other than comfortable. The first 2 days were what I expected. Good weather, good miles. The trail and the condition I remembered from my previous visits. My pack at the weight I had dialed in over years of backpacking. My body finding its trail rhythm by the afternoon of the first day and staying there. I camped at my planned sites both nights and slept well and ate well and made the kind of notes in my trail journal that I make on trips that are going exactly as expected. The second night, I camped at a site near a seasonal creek that had enough water running in it from recent rains to make filtering easy. And I noted in my journal that the forest floor was wet and the trail had been soft in places, and that the previous night's rain had left the kind of saturated conditions that the Shawnee produces when it rains the leaf litter. Dark with moisture, the soil beneath it soft, the trail surface in the low sections approaching mud. I noted this practically as weather information, not as anything significant. I broke camp on the third morning and started walking at about 7, which is later than I usually start, but I had slept well, and the morning was gray and soft, and the forest was doing the thing it does in early morning after rain. The light filtered and green, and the whole understory beaded with water. I had perhaps 14 miles to cover to reach my planned third night campsite, and 14 miles in the Shawnee, on a good day, takes me about 6 hours. More if the trail is soft. The trail was soft. I adjusted my pace accordingly and settled in. I became aware of the sound on the left side at around noon. I want to be precise about when I became aware of it, because I have thought carefully about whether it was there before noon, and I simply was not paying attention, and the honest answer is that I do not know. What I know is that, at approximately noon, on a section of trail that ran along the side of a low ridge with the forest on my left dropping away into a hollow, I became aware of movement in the brush on my left side, at a distance of perhaps 15 to 20 feet from the trail edge. Not a single movement, a continuous presence of movement, the kind of low-level sound that a body moving through brush produces when it is trying to move quietly, the occasional displacement of a leaf or a twig, the subtle shift of weight that disturbs the forest floor in a way that is distinct from wind. Because wind does not have weight and does not have rhythm. I stopped walking. The movement on my left stopped. I stood on the trail and listened for perhaps 2 minutes, and the forest was quiet, not unnaturally quiet, not the silence before. Something quality that I have heard described and experienced on 1 or 2 previous occasions. But the ordinary quiet of a forest in the middle of the day when the birds are not particularly active and the wind is low and you have stopped moving through the leaf litter. After 2 minutes, I started walking again. Within perhaps 20 seconds, the movement on my left resumed. Same distance, same quality of sound, keeping pace. I went through the rational inventory. A deer paralleling me at that distance was possible, and deer do sometimes follow or parallel hikers out of curiosity before their instinct overrides the curiosity and they disappear. A person moving parallel to the trail was possible. Trail runners sometimes bushwhack on routes parallel to marked trails, and the Shawnee has enough local users that an off-trail presence was not inherently strange. A large dog was possible. I went through these possibilities methodically as I walked, and the sound continued on my left at its consistent 15 to 20 feet and its consistent pace matching mine, and I tested the possibilities by varying my speed, slowing to almost nothing, then pushing to a pace that was just short of uncomfortable. The sound varied with my speed, not with a half-second lag, not with the slight imprecision of an animal reacting to my movement with the synchrony of something that was either very good at matching a moving target or was somehow aware of my pace before my pace changed, anticipating rather than reacting. I stopped testing after about 30 minutes of this and just walked. I made the decision to treat it as a benign presence and to simply get to my campsite and see if the sound was still there in the evening. This decision required a level of self-management that I am not going to minimize. The sound on my left was producing in me a sustained low-level alarm response that I was actively working to suppress, the kind of alert state that raises your heart rate slightly and keeps your attention divided between where you are going and what is beside you. I have hiked in the company of this kind of alert state before, in bear country, and I know how to function within it without letting it become incapacitating. I functioned. I walked. The sound continued. The rain from the previous days had pooled in the low sections of trail, and by mid-afternoon I was walking through the best tracking conditions I have ever seen on a trail. Not isolated wet patches, but a long, continuous section of soft mud, perhaps a quarter mile. The surface, the consistency of cake batter, and the color of dark chocolate, the kind of surface that records everything. I have studied animal tracking, and I can read a muddy trail the way some people read a newspaper. I was looking at this section with the part of my attention that was not focused on the sound to my left, thinking about what I would find in it. I crossed the mud section. My boots sank perhaps an inch with each step, the prints left behind deep and clear, and with the specific layered impression of Vibram lug soles that I have been using for years and know well. I could feel the mud sucking slightly at each step, the resistance of saturated soil releasing my boot with a soft sound at each lift. I was fully aware of the sound on my left during the crossing, which did not change in character, the same pace, the same distance, the same quality of presence in the brush. Whatever was there had been in the brush, in the forest on the left side of the trail, and whatever was there had been keeping pace with me, and the mud section extended to the left of the trail edge for at least 30 feet, before the ground rose toward the ridge, and 30 feet of soft mud will record the weight of a bird. I crossed to the dry trail on the far side, and I stopped and I turned around and I looked at the mud. My prints were there, a clear line of deep impressions tracking from where I had entered to where I was standing. The trail surface on both sides of my prints, extending to the trail edges, was undisturbed. The mud off the left side of the trail, between the trail edge and the tree line from which the sound had been coming, was undisturbed, not compressed differently from my weight, not showing the lighter impression of a deer or a dog or a person moving more carefully than I had moved. Undisturbed. The surface had the smooth, slightly glossy quality of mud that has not been touched, the same surface it had shown when I entered the section from the other end. Raindrops had left tiny craters in it that were still intact. Nothing had crossed that mud on the left side of the trail. Nothing had moved through that space. The sound had been there. The mud said nothing had been there. I stood at the edge of the mud section, and I looked at it for a long time. I am going to tell you what I thought, because my thoughts in that moment are part of the record. I thought, there is something wrong with what I am seeing. I thought, I know what I heard, and I know what the mud is showing me, and these two things cannot both be true, and yet they are both in front of me, and I cannot make them resolve. I thought about the rational inventory I had run through earlier, the deer, the person, the dog, and I thought about how all of those explanations required weight, required physical presence on a surface, required the displacement of material that mud, at this saturation level, records with complete reliability. I thought about whether I could have imagined the sound for the past several hours, sustained an auditory hallucination for the better part of an afternoon on a trail I knew well in conditions I had no particular reason to find stressful. I have thought about this possibility many times since, and I cannot dismiss it entirely, and I also cannot accept it, because the sound had been there with too much specificity and too much responsiveness to my own movement to be something I generated internally without knowing I was generating it. I did not camp that night. I had been planning to camp at a site approximately 2 more miles along the trail, but I did not do it. I made the decision standing at the edge of the mud section and looking at the undisturbed surface on the left side of the trail, and the decision was made not through reasoning, but through the same instinct that I have learned over 18 years of backcountry travel to listen to when it speaks clearly, and it was speaking clearly. I turned and looked at the trail ahead, and I made the calculation. I had perhaps 4 hours of daylight. The trail out to the nearest trailhead was approximately 8 miles. I had a headlamp if I needed it. I could make 8 miles by dark or shortly after. I started walking. The sound on my left resumed within a minute of my starting. It stayed with me for the next 2 hours. The full length of the time I was on that section of trail before the route turned east and began climbing toward the bluffs, where the forest changed character and the undergrowth thinned and the sound gradually faded. I noticed the fading, and I did not feel relief exactly. I felt the absence of something, which is a different experience from relief, and in some ways a more unsettling one, because absence implies the thing was there, and the thing is no longer there, rather than the thing never being there at all. The thing had been there. It was no longer there. I did not know what either of those facts meant. I reached the trailhead at 9:15 in the evening. The last 2 miles were in full dark, and I had my headlamp on, and the trail was familiar enough from previous trips that the dark did not slow me significantly. I reached my car and I sat in it for a while without starting the engine. I ate the last of my food bar and drank some water, and I looked at the dark tree line at the edge of the parking area, which was about 30 feet from where I was sitting, and I thought about the mud section and what it had shown me and what it had not shown me, and I started the engine and drove home. I have been back to the Shawnee once since that trip, not to hike but to drive through. I did not get out of the car. I am not going to tell you that I will never hike there again, because I do not know what I will do, but what I know is that the Shawnee has a quality now that it did not have before that third day, a quality in my relationship with it, rather than in the forest itself, which is unchanged and which has no knowledge of or interest in what I heard, and what the mud did not show me. The forest is the forest. It was there before I came to it, and it will be there after I stop coming to it. Whatever was on my left side for 6 hours on the third day of my last loop, whatever moved through the forest at a consistent 15 to 20 feet from the trail at precisely my pace, and stopped when I stopped and resumed. When I resumed and left no mark in mud that recorded every raindrop that is also still there. I am as confident of this as I am of anything. It was there before I arrived, and it is there now, and it will be there the next time someone walks that trail, and the next time someone looks back at a perfect mud section and finds their own footprints clean and clear, and the space beside them undisturbed, and stands at the edge of what the mud shows and what it does not show, and tries to make those two things resolve. I have been trying for 8 months. They do not resolve. I do not think they are going to. I run alone. I want to establish this as a choice rather than a circumstance, because it matters to understanding why I was alone on the Laurel Fork Trail system at 5:30 in the morning in Tucker County, West Virginia, and why I stayed alone on it for as long as I did before I stopped making that choice. I have been a trail runner for 11 years and a serious ultramarathon competitor for 6 of those, and in 6 years of ultramarathon training, I have run thousands of miles of trail alone, because running alone is fundamentally different from running with someone else in ways that matter to me. The pace is yours, the attention is yours, the quality of the experience is determined entirely by the relationship between you and the terrain and the conditions and nothing else. I am good at being alone on a trail. I am comfortable with the sounds and the silences and the specific quality of attention that moving fast through remote terrain requires. I say this because I want you to understand that what I felt on the Laurel Fork at mile 12 was not the product of a person who was frightened of solitude or susceptible to the particular anxiety that isolated places produce in people who are not accustomed to them. I was accustomed to them. What happened on the Laurel Fork was not the product of being unfamiliar with the situation. It was the product of something being wrong with the situation in a way that my familiarity with it made unmistakably clear. The Laurel Fork Trail System in Tucker County is one of the more remote trail systems in West Virginia, which is itself one of the more remote states in the eastern United States. And I mean remote in the genuine, rather than the promotional sense. Remote as in the parking area is a long drive from the nearest town. The cell signal drops out several miles before you reach the trailhead, and the trail itself runs through terrain that is varied enough and dense enough that you can be 2 miles from a road and feel as though you are in the center of something very large. The Laurel Fork of the Cheat River runs through the system, and the trail parallels it for sections, dropping down to the creek level and climbing back to the ridgelines in the way that West Virginia trails do, the elevation change constant and the terrain demanding. I had been running the Laurel Fork system as part of my training for a 100-mile ultra-marathon I had entered for the following spring, using the terrain's difficulty to build the kind of strength that flat or moderate trail training does not produce. I had been out to the system 4 times that season. I knew the trails reasonably well. The morning of the run I am describing was a Saturday in late September, which in the West Virginia mountains means the hardwoods are beginning to turn, and the mornings are cold enough to make you glad of the layer you brought, and the afternoons warm enough to make you glad you did not bring more. I was planning a 21-mile training run, starting at the trailhead at first light and moving through the system's main loop at a pace that was comfortable rather than competitive. The point was time on feet and elevation gain rather than speed. I had my pack with water and food for the day, my phone on airplane mode to preserve battery, my emergency contact notified of my plan, and my expected return. Standard protocol for a solo trail run in remote terrain. I had done this dozens of times. The first 11 miles were the run I planned. The light came up slowly through the hemlock canopy. The trail surface was in good condition from a dry week following a wet September, and I was in the specific productive state that good training runs produce when everything is working, the body finding its rhythm early and holding it, the mind quieting to the narrow present tense focus of movement through terrain. I moved through the hemlock forest that occupies the lower sections of the system, the trees old enough that the canopy was high and relatively open despite the density of the trunks, and then climbed to the ridgeline sections where the hardwoods were beginning their color, and then descended again into the creek drainage, where the rhododendron thicket began. I want to describe the rhododendron thicket because it is central to understanding what happened, and because it has a specific character that I think about often now. Appalachian rhododendron at maturity forms the densest natural ground-level cover in the eastern forest. The branches interlace at a height of about 6 to 8 feet. The leaves are thick and evergreen and block light effectively, and the interior of a rhododendron thicket has a particular quality of darkness and enclosure that is unlike any other forest environment. From the outside, standing on the trail with the thicket on the downhill side dropping toward the creek, you cannot see more than a few feet into it. The interior is a maze of interlocked branches, and the visual depth is essentially zero. You can hear into a rhododendron thicket, but you cannot see into it, and what you hear when you listen carefully is the small sounds of whatever is moving through it, amplified and made strange by the enclosed acoustic environment. I knew this. I had run through this section before. The thicket had never been anything other than a thicket. I was at mile 12, on the downhill side of a ridgeline traverse where the trail ran along the slope with the creek drainage below me on the left and the thicket thick and dark on that side, when I became aware of something moving through the rhododendron. Not a single movement, a sustained movement, keeping pace with my stride. Not crashing through the branches, Not the rough disturbance of a large animal forcing its way through dense cover, but a fluid and continuous movement that threaded through the thicket in a way that the thicket structure should not have accommodated at the pace I was moving. I was running at approximately 9 minutes per mile at that point. 9 minutes per mile through rhododendron of that density is not something a deer or a bear or any animal I can name does with the fluid continuity I was hearing. The sound was wrong for what the environment should have produced. I slowed to a walk. The sound slowed with me, maintaining its position at roughly the same distance into the thicket, perhaps 10 or 15 feet to my left, downhill, at the edge of what I could hear clearly. I stopped completely. The sound stopped completely. I stood on the trail and I listened, and the forest was quiet, in the way that the forest is quiet when you have stopped moving through it, and the birds have settled back after your passage, and there is simply the creek below and the light, wind, and nothing else. I waited perhaps 30 seconds and heard nothing, and I started running again, and within 30 seconds, not within 5 seconds, not instantly, but within the specific delay of something that needed a moment to match my renewed pace, the movement in the thicket resumed. I want to be honest about what I thought in the moment, rather than what I have thought in retrospect, because the two are different. In the moment, I thought, mountain lion, not because mountain lions are established in West Virginia, where they were extirpated in the 19th century and have not had a confirmed breeding population since, but because the movement had the quality of a large cat moving through cover fluid, continuous, not crashing or thrashing, but threading, and because a mountain lion would explain the pace matching, which predators do when they are shadowing prey. I am a trail runner, and I have read enough about predator behavior to know that big cats sometimes shadow potential prey before deciding whether to pursue, and in that first minute of understanding, I was working with the mountain lion theory and managing my response to it, which in the case of a mountain lion on a trail is to not run away at speed, and to make yourself seem large and aware of the predator's presence. I did not stop running. I know this is inconsistent with the mountain lion protocol, but I made the decision in the context of being 12 miles from the trailhead, with 9 miles remaining, and being on a schedule my emergency contact was expecting me to meet, and I made the further decision that if it was a mountain lion and it was going to do something, it would have done it in the first 30 seconds, rather than keeping pace with me at a consistent distance. I kept running. I kept the pace steady. I spoke aloud once, saying something like, "I see you," which is in the general category of things you say to a predator to demonstrate awareness. And the movement in the thicket continued without any response to my voice, neither withdrawing nor closing the distance. I was now fully alert in the physiological sense. The training pace that had felt comfortable an hour earlier was now being maintained by adrenaline as much as fitness. My heart rate elevated above what the effort required. My attention split between the trail surface in front of me and the sound in the thicket to my left. I covered 2 miles in this state, the sound consistent and continuous throughout, and I reached the first creek crossing, where the trail dropped to the creek bank and the rhododendron opened up to the stream side, and there was a section of perhaps 30 feet of exposed creek bank before the trail climbed back into the thicket on the other side. The creek bank was soft. Recent rains and the creek's natural flooding had left the soil at the bank's edge in a saturated, soft state, not true mud, not the deep liquid mud of a swamped trail, but wet soil, with enough give to accept and retain an impression. I crossed the bank quickly, hit the trail on the other side, and kept running. 3 seconds later, I was back in the thicket section, and the sound had resumed on my left. I had not heard the sound cross the open bank behind me. I had not heard anything on the open bank at all. I ran another quarter mile and stopped, and turned around and went back to the bank section, and I looked at it from the trail edge. My tracks were there, clear and deep in the wet soil, the specific pattern of my trail shoes preserved in the surface. Between my tracks and the edge of the rhododendron thicket on the uphill side of the bank, the side where the following presence would have had to cross to continue with me, the soil was undisturbed. The entire bank's surface was undisturbed except for my own prints and the faint marks of a small animal, a raccoon, I thought from the shape, that had been at the bank's edge recently. Nothing had crossed the bank on the left side. Whatever had been moving through the rhododendron had not crossed the exposed bank surface. I stood there for perhaps a minute. I am not going to pretend I was calm. My heart rate was significantly elevated and not from the running, and I was standing at the edge of a muddy creek bank in Tucker County, West Virginia, looking at clear evidence that something had been moving beside me for 2 miles and had left no mark on soft soil. I went back to the mountain lion theory and I held it up and I looked at it, and I understood that a mountain lion crossing soft creek bank soil leaves tracks. Mountain lions are ambush predators, not light-footed. They are large animals with substantial weight, and a mountain lion crossing that bank would have left tracks at least as deep as my own. There were no tracks. The theory did not hold. I ran the remaining 7 miles to the trailhead faster than I have run anything in my life. Not faster than my race pace, faster than my race pace in a way that I have never replicated in training or in a race since. The sound kept pace with me for approximately 4 more miles, through the second creek bank section, where again my tracks were clear and the adjacent soil was undisturbed, and then it faded as the trail climbed toward the ridge and the rhododendron gave way to open hardwood forest. And in the open hardwood forest, there was nothing. No sound, no presence, no movement in the trees. The last 3 miles to the trailhead were ordinary miles in ordinary forest, and I ran them in a state of adrenaline and focus, and the specific kind of clarity that comes after sustained fear when the immediate cause has resolved, but the body has not fully processed the resolution. I reached the trailhead, and I sat on the tailgate of my truck for a long time. I drank water, and I ate something, and I sat in the thin September sunshine, and I thought about the creek bank and the soil and what was not in it. I am a person who has spent 6 years trail running in remote terrain, and I have accumulated in those 6 years a substantial knowledge of wildlife behavior and sign and the specific ways that animals interact with runners and hikers in backcountry settings. I have been followed by curious deer. I have had coyotes run parallel to my route across open meadows. I have startled bears and had black bears lope along ahead of me for a 1/4 mile before angling away into the forest. None of these experiences produced in me what the Laurel Fork produced, and what the Laurel Fork produced was not primarily the sound in the thicket, as unsettling as that was, but the creek bank. The creek bank is the fact I cannot put down. The creek bank is the specific, physical, observable fact that something moved with me for 2 miles through dense rhododendron at running pace and left no mark in soft, wet soil when it crossed the open streamside. I have run the Laurel Fork 3 times since that September, because it is the best training terrain within driving distance, and I am not the kind of person who abandons a training system because of an experience I cannot explain. Each time I have run it, I have crossed both creek banks and looked at my tracks and the adjacent soil. Each time the soil has been undisturbed in the way it should be undisturbed when nothing has crossed it. I do not know if this is reassuring or not. I have not heard the sound in the thicket again on any of those 3 runs. I do not know if this is reassuring either. The thicket is still there. The creek banks are still there. The soft soil at the bank edge still records everything that crosses it, except for the thing that crossed it, without leaving a mark, which was there and then was not there, and which I have no better explanation for now than I had sitting on the tailgate of my truck in the September sunshine in Tucker County, which is no explanation at all. Marcus and I have been hiking together for 14 years, and we have an understanding that was built over that time and that I value, because it is based on honesty rather than comfort. We are the kind of friends who tell each other when something is wrong rather than managing each other's feelings about it. And this quality has served us well on trail when conditions change or plans need to be revised, and you need someone who will give you accurate information rather than reassurance. I am telling you this because the Roan Highlands account requires that kind of honesty, and because Marcus and I have had one long conversation about that day and have not had another. And what I want to give you is the honest account rather than the account that makes the most sense, because the account that makes the most sense is not what happened. The Roan Highlands section of the Appalachian Trail runs along the border of Tennessee and North Carolina at elevations between 5,000 and 6,000 feet, through terrain that is unlike anything else on the AT in the eastern United States, open highland meadows called balds. The trail running exposed across the ridgeline with views that extend for miles in every direction on a clear day. The sky enormous, and the scale of the landscape genuinely different from the forested sections that constitute most of the trail. It is beautiful in a way that requires adjustment when you first encounter it, because you have been walking through dense forest for days, and the openness is sudden and complete. Marcus and I had been planning the Rhone section for 2 years. It is a popular stretch, and we wanted it in the right season and under the right conditions. And the right season and conditions are September on a clear week, which is what we had. We were section hiking the AT over several years of weekend and vacation trips, doing it in pieces as our schedules allowed, and the Rhone section was the piece we had been looking forward to most. We started at Carver's Gap and walked north in the early morning, with the intention of covering the full Rhone Highland traverse and camping near the end of the exposed section, before descending into the forested terrain the following day. The morning was exactly what September in that part of Appalachia can be: the light clear and precise, the temperature comfortable for hiking, the distant ridges sharp-edged, and the sky a deep blue without haze. We were moving well and in good spirits, and the conversation was the easy conversation of people who have been hiking together for a long time and who share a sensibility about what matters on a trail and what does not. I was happy that morning. I want to note that specifically because it is relevant. There was nothing in my state of mind at the start of the day that would have predisposed me to the kind of heightened attention or anxiety that produces the misinterpretation of ordinary things. We had been walking for perhaps 3 hours when I first noticed it. We were on the section of trail that runs along the western ridge of the Highland system, with the open meadow descending to the right and then rising to the eastern ridge, which runs roughly parallel at a distance I estimated as a quarter mile. The eastern ridge was clearly visible. The September light put it in sharp relief against the sky. The grass on its flanks, the gold green of late summer highland grass, the ridge crest a clean line. I was looking at it in the way you look at a landscape you are moving through, taking it in as part of the whole picture, when I noticed movement on the eastern ridge. Movement at that distance resolves as shape change, rather than detail: a dark area becoming a different shape, a line shifting its position relative to background. What I saw was something along the ridge crest that was changing shape in the way that a moving figure changes shape when seen from a distance. Not the static shape of a rock or a dead tree, but the dynamic shape of something in motion. I watched it for perhaps 30 seconds, while Marcus continued talking about something I was no longer fully tracking, and then I interrupted him and said there was something on the eastern ridge and pointed. Marcus looked. He said he saw movement. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he wasn't sure. Maybe a deer, maybe a person. We both watched for another minute, and the movement continued along the ridge crest at a pace that appeared consistent with walking, not running, not the bounding gait of a deer, but the steady forward progression of something walking. We were walking too. I had not thought about this consciously yet, but we were walking, and the movement on the eastern ridge was walking, and we were parallel to each other across the quarter mile of highland meadow, and our paces appeared to be matched. I said to Marcus, "Let's stop for a minute." We stopped. We looked at the eastern ridge. The movement had stopped. I waited perhaps 30 seconds and said nothing, and watched the ridge, and there was no movement on it. The ridge was static grass, the clean line of the crest, the sky beyond it. I said, "Let's start walking again." We started walking. Within about 20 seconds, the movement on the eastern ridge resumed. Not immediately, not with the instant response of something that was watching us and reacting to us, but with the slight delay of something that had been stationary and was resuming its own forward movement, the way you resume walking when you have paused to look at something and then continue. The delay was perhaps the most disturbing element of those early observations, because it was not the delay of a reaction, it was the delay of a resumption, as though it had paused because it was pausing, and not because we had paused. And the coincidence was too complete to be a coincidence. Marcus said, "That's strange." I agreed that it was strange. We kept walking. I have a camera with a 400mm zoom lens that I carry on trips, where the wildlife viewing is likely to be good, and the Rhone Highlands in September is exactly that kind of trip. The hawks are migrating and the highland birds are distinctive, and the clear weather makes photography productive. I got the camera out and I stopped walking, and I aimed the lens at the eastern ridge, and I looked through it at the section where the movement had been. The ridge was empty. Through the 400mm zoom, which brings a quarter mile to a very manageable visual distance, I could see the grass on the ridge crest in detail, individual stems, the variation in color, between the grazed and ungrazed sections. The slight dip and rise of the ridge's topography. Nothing was on the ridge. No animal, no person, no shape that could account for the movement I had been seeing with my naked eye. I swept the lens along the full visible length of the ridge, in both directions from where the movement had been. Nothing. I lowered the camera and looked at the ridge with my naked eye, and the movement was there again, the same dark area, the same dynamic shape, continuing at the same walking pace. I raised the camera and looked through the zoom. The ridge was empty. I lowered the camera. The movement was visible. I did this 4 times, alternating between the zoom lens and naked eye, and the result was consistent. Naked eye, movement, zoom lens, nothing. Marcus was watching over my shoulder and confirmed what I was seeing, or not seeing, and he was quiet in a way that I recognized as Marcus being careful about what he was going to say. He said, "Maybe it's a trick of the light," I said. "Maybe." I said it the way you say maybe when you are trying to leave a door open for an explanation you do not actually believe. We photographed the ridge extensively. I have the photographs on my hard drive, and I have looked at them many times since, and they show what the zoom lens showed in real time: grass, the ridge crest, the sky, nothing in motion. In the photographs, there is no movement, no shape, no feature of the ridge that accounts for what we were seeing. 14 photographs of the eastern ridge taken across the span of about an hour, in good light with a lens capable of resolving detail at that distance, and none of them show anything. Whatever we were watching across the highland meadow was not appearing in the photographs. I am going to describe one specific instance from the middle of the day because it is the clearest single example of what the full day was like. We stopped for lunch at a flat section of trail with a good view of both ridges, and we sat down and got our food out, and while we were eating, we watched the eastern ridge. The movement had been continuous for the previous 2 hours, keeping pace with us across the meadow and the ridge features, and when we sat down, it stopped. We watched the ridge while we ate our lunch about 40 minutes, and the ridge was static throughout. A hawk passed over it at one point, clearly visible as a hawk because it was moving in 3 dimensions, and at a hawk's speed, and its shape was unmistakably avian. That was the only movement on the ridge for the full 40 minutes. We packed up and stood and resumed walking, and within 30 seconds the movement on the eastern ridge resumed. Neither of us said anything about it at that point. We had been watching it for hours, and we had run out of things to say about it that were useful. At the end of the exposed section, where the trail begins its descent into forested terrain on the north end of the highlands, the movement on the eastern ridge continued until we reached the first trees, and then it ceased. I cannot tell you whether it ceased because we were entering forest and the line of sight to the eastern ridge was broken, or whether it ceased because whatever was there stopped when we entered the trees. I cannot tell you because the cessation was simultaneous with our entry into the forest, and I have no way of separating those two things. What I can tell you is that it had not ceased before we entered the trees, that I was watching the eastern ridge until the first substantial tree cover blocked my view, and the movement was there until that moment. The soil at the trail's edge where the descent into the forest began was soft. The transition zone between the open highland and the forested slope, where the vegetation changes and the soil holds moisture differently, had produced a section of soft earth that took impressions well. Marcus and I both noted this, and when we had descended a short way, we turned back and looked at our footprints in the soft soil at the trail's edge. Our prints were clear and distinct, the impressions of our boots in the soft earth exactly as you would expect. On the other side of the trail, the eastern side, the side toward the ridge we had been watching all day, the side where something would have had to pass if it had come down from the eastern ridge to continue alongside us as we descended, the soil was undisturbed, smooth, no impression of any kind. We made camp that evening in the forested section, and we did not talk about the eastern ridge over dinner in any direct way. We talked around it, made references to it in the oblique way of two people who are both sitting with the same uncomfortable thing and have not decided what to do with it. Marcus said once that he was not sure what he had seen, and I said I was not sure either, and that was the closest we came to a direct conversation about it that evening. In the morning, the trail continued through forest, and we finished the section and drove home, and a week later Marcus called me, and we had the one conversation about it that we have had, which lasted about 20 minutes, and which ended with both of us saying we did not have an explanation, and that we were not sure we wanted one, and that has been the shape of our relationship with the Roan Highlands account since. I have looked at the photographs again recently. 14 photographs of an empty ridge in good September light. I have zoomed in on the sections where the movement was most clearly visible to the naked eye, and I have found nothing. The ridge grass, the crest line, the sky, the ordinary landscape of a highland meadow on a clear day. I have thought about optics, about the way that different viewing instruments process light differently, about whether there is a wavelength or a phenomenon that the naked eye detects and a camera sensor does not. I am not an optician, and I cannot assess these possibilities technically. What I know is that Marcus and I both saw the movement with our naked eyes across the full span of a walking day, and neither of us could see it through the zoom lens, and it does not appear in any of the 14 photographs, and it stopped. When we entered the trees, and the soil at the descent was undisturbed on the eastern side. I know these things, and I cannot make them into a coherent account of something ordinary. I have been trying for 2 years. The Roan Highlands are still there. Marcus and I are planning to go back next fall. I do not know if we will actually go. I know that if we do go, and the eastern ridge is empty all day, I will be relieved. And I know that if it is not empty, I will be looking for the photographs to show something this time. And I know already that they will not show anything. And I know already that the soil at the trail's edge on the descent will be undisturbed on the eastern side. And I think what I am most afraid of is not the movement on the ridge, but the confirmation that the movement is there, and the photographs are empty, and the soil is clean, which would mean the things I saw were real and the record is blank, and there is nothing to show anyone, and no way to make it make sense, and no version of it that resolves. I chose the Chunky Gal Trail specifically because it is not popular. I want to be clear about this as the starting point of the account because the choice was deliberate and the deliberateness is relevant. I am a person who researches trails carefully before committing to them, who reads trip reports and checks permit systems, and thinks about what kind of experience I am looking for and matches the trail to the intention. And what I was looking for on this particular trip was genuine solitude, the kind that only comes on trails that most people have not heard of, and that the hiking community has not yet absorbed into the circuit of well-documented and heavily trafficked routes. The Chunky Gal Trail in the Nantahala National Forest in western North Carolina is that kind of trail, old, lightly maintained, not on anyone's top 10 list. The name itself, a local reference that does not communicate glamour or scenery to someone browsing trail databases from a distance. I found it through a very old trip report on a forum that had been posted by someone who had clearly not found what they were looking for on it. The report full of complaints about the trail's condition and the lack of views and the difficulty of navigation in places. I read that report and thought, this is exactly what I want. I have been doing solo backpacking trips for 12 years, which is long enough to have developed the skills and the self-knowledge that solo backpacking requires. I know how to read terrain and navigate with map and compass when the trail is unclear. I know how to manage food and water in a multi-day context. I know how to manage my own psychology in extended solitude, which is not something everyone can do. The specific challenges of solo camping, the way the mind works differently when there is no other person present to externalize your experience to, the heightened perception of the environment that comes with being alone in it. I have done solo trips in remote terrain across 12 years, and I have had difficult experiences. A bad storm pinned me down for a day and a half on a trip in the Smokies several years ago. I have had navigation errors that added unexpected miles and stress to trips in terrain I did not know well enough. I have had the kind of close wildlife encounter that raises your heart rate and reminds you that you are in a place that is not managed for your safety. I know the difference between the ordinary challenges of solo backcountry travel and what I experienced on the Chunky Gal. The difference is not subtle. I started at the southern terminus on a Thursday in late October and planned 4 days on the trail, covering the full length and exiting at the northern terminus where I had arranged a shuttle. Late October in the Nantahala means the hardwoods are at their color peak and the leaves are beginning to fall, and the forest floor is accumulating the first heavy layer of the season's leaf fall, which creates a specific acoustic environment. Every footstep is audible in the dry, crisp way of walking on a surface that has been laid down fresh, rather than compressed and matted by rain and time. I noted this on the first day with pleasure because I liked the sound of walking through fallen leaves, and because the dry leaf layer would make excellent reading for animal sign. I was attentive to the trail and the forest around it in the way I am always attentive on the first day of a solo trip, which is with the full freshness of attention before the familiarity of the days ahead settles it into a more automatic mode. The first night's camp was unremarkable. I found a flat site near a small stream, set up my tent and my cooking area with the care that leave no trace practice requires, cooked my meal, sat outside for an hour watching the last of the light go out of the sky through the leaf canopy, and went to my tent at around 8:30. The forest was quiet in the specific late October way of a forest from which most of the migratory birds have already departed, and in which the remaining wildlife is preparing for winter in ways that reduce their activity. I slept well and woke at first light without having heard anything in the night that was not ordinary. The second night was where it began. I had put in good miles and found my second campsite in the early afternoon, which gave me time to set up carefully and to explore the immediate area of my camp before dark, a habit I have developed on solo trips, because knowing the terrain around your camp reduces the strangeness of sounds in the night, when you can place them in a landscape you have visually mapped. My site was in a section of hardwood forest with good flat ground, the leaf layer thick and dry, the nearest trees large enough to have the canopy height that gives a forest site its sense of space. I cooked and cleaned and hung my food bag and went to my tent at around 9. I was not yet asleep when I heard it. I had been lying in my sleeping bag in the quiet post-dinner state that camping produces, the body tired and the mind settling toward sleep, when a sound in the leaf litter outside my tent registered at the level that pulls you back from the edge of sleep, specific enough to be a particular sound, rather than background noise, directional enough to place. It was to my right, at what I estimated as 15 to 20 feet from the tent wall, the sound of something moving through dry leaves. A single step, a pause, another step, the rhythm of something walking carefully, placing each foot deliberately, rather than moving continuously. I lay still and listened. The sound continued for perhaps a minute, moving from my right to the area directly behind my tent, still at that consistent 15 to 20 foot distance, still with the deliberate step and pause rhythm. Then it moved from behind the tent to my left side and continued forward, maintaining the same distance, and I understood with a clarity that was uncomfortable in its precision that what I was hearing was a circumferential movement, something walking in a circle around my tent at a consistent radius, using the dry leaf litter as its medium, moving at a steady pace, not crossing through my camp, not approaching the tent, walking around it. I sat up in my sleeping bag and I put my hand on my headlamp, but I did not turn it on. I listened. The sound completed what I estimated as one full circuit and began a second. The step and pause rhythm was consistent throughout, not the sound of an animal pausing to forage or drink, which varies as the animal moves between one type of behavior and another, but the sound of something that was doing one specific thing and was continuing to do it. Walking the perimeter of my site in a regular circuit. On the second circuit, I timed the duration with my watch. Approximately 4 minutes for a full circuit, which at the distance I was estimating meant a walking pace that was neither slow nor fast, but deliberate. I turned on my headlamp and unzipped the tent door and shone the light outward. The forest was the forest, the trees, the leaf litter, the dark between the trunks, nothing visible in the beam's range. I swept the light around a full circle from the tent door. Nothing. I sat in the doorway for several minutes, the headlamp on, and heard nothing. I closed the tent and turned the light off and lay back in my sleeping bag, and within 2 minutes the sound resumed. Same distance, same rhythm, same circumferential movement. I turned the light on again. The sound stopped. I turned the light off. After a minute, the sound resumed. I did this 5 times. The pattern was absolutely consistent. Sound in darkness, silence in light, sound when darkness returned. Not a gradual resumption, not a cautious return, but a clean stop when the light appeared and a clean resumption when it was withdrawn, as though the light was a specific condition that the sound source was managing rather than responding to. I lay in my tent with the light off, and I listened to the circling for perhaps 2 more hours before it stopped, around midnight, and I was awake for a long time after it stopped, before I slept. In the morning, I examined my campsite with the thoroughness I have described. My footprints from the previous evening's camp setup were clear in the soft soil near the stream, and at the edges of my site where I had walked on ground not covered by the heavy leaf layer. The leaf litter in the zone where I had heard the circling the area at 15 to 20 feet from the tent, the radius I had estimated was undisturbed. Completely undisturbed, in the specific way of a dry leaf layer that has not been walked on. The leaves were flat and overlapping, and showed none of the disturbance that walking through a leaf layer produces, which is compression and displacement, and the exposure of the darker leaves beneath. I walked through a section of the leaf layer myself to establish the comparison, and the contrast was immediate and clear. My path through the leaves was obviously disturbed, and the perimeter of my camp was obviously not. The third night was the same. I had moved to a different campsite, several miles further along the trail, specifically to see whether the circling was associated with the location or whether it would follow me, and the answer was that it followed me. The same time beginning around 10 and continuing until around midnight, the same distance from the tent, the same deliberate step and pause rhythm, the same clean stop and resumption in response to my headlamp. I lay in my tent for the full 2 hours and listened, and when it stopped I lay awake until about 3 in the morning before I slept. In the morning, the leaf litter at the perimeter of my new campsite was undisturbed. My own footprints were clear where I had walked on soft soil. The leaves where the circling had been were flat and undisturbed. The fourth night, I did not stay for. I woke at 3:30 in the morning, not from any sound, not from any external event, but from the specific quality of wakefulness. That is its own decision rather than the response to something else. And I lay in my sleeping bag for perhaps 15 minutes, and then I got up and I packed my tent and my gear in the dark. By headlamp, and I walked out on the trail. I had a full day's worth of hiking remaining to reach the northern trailhead, but I walked through the dark and the gray, pre-dawn, and the full morning, and I reached the trailhead at about 2 in the afternoon, and I drove the 3 hours home without stopping for more than fuel. I did not listen to anything on the drive. I sat with the road and the miles and let the distance accumulate between me and the Nantahala until the distance felt like something manageable. I have told this account to 2 people. One is my partner, who received it with the seriousness it deserved and asked no questions that I found difficult to answer, which is to say she did not try to explain it. The other is a friend who has done a great deal of solo backpacking and who listened carefully and said he had heard something similar described by someone else. Once, years ago, on a different trail, in a different state, and that the description had matched mine in the specific detail of the circumferential movement and the consistent distance from the tent and the undisturbed leaf litter in the morning. He did not tell me what the other person had concluded about it because the other person had not concluded anything, which is where I am also. I have not returned to the Chunky Gal Trail, and I have not returned to the Nantahala National Forest, and I do not know if I will. What I know is that 3 nights on a trail I chose for its solitude produced something that I cannot account for, something that followed me from campsite to campsite and walked in precise circles around my tent in the dark without leaving a mark on the dry October leaves, and that the not leaving a mark is the fact I carry most heavily, more than the sound itself, more than the behavior of it, more than the 2 hours of lying awake and listening to a consistent and deliberate circuit that I could not see and could not explain and cannot put down. The leaves were undisturbed. They are still undisturbed, wherever the next person camps on the Chunky Gal Trail, whenever the next person camps there in the dry October leaf fall, lying in their tent in the dark, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime quiet, listening for what the quiet contains. I have hiked the Bear Wallow Mountain Trail in Henderson County, North Carolina, more times than I can count precisely, which is the kind of familiarity that builds over years of living near a trailhead and returning to a place because it gives you what you need reliably and without complication. I started hiking it in my early 30s when I moved to the area and needed somewhere to walk, and I have been going back ever since, sometimes for the photography, which is my primary reason for most of my outdoor time, and sometimes simply because I know it and it knows me, in the way that a frequently visited place develops a kind of mutual familiarity that newer places do not have. I have been on the Bear Wallow Trail in every season and every weather condition it produces, and I know the sound of it, the specific acoustic character of each section, The way the open meadows near the summit carry wind differently from the forested lower sections. The way the creek crossing sounds in spring versus late fall when the water is lower. I know this trail's sounds. What I heard on the November day I am describing was not a sound this trail makes. I went up on a Tuesday, which I chose because weekday Novembers on Bear Wallow are as close to empty as a trail within reasonable driving distance of a town gets. The hikers who use it heavily in the spring and fall have mostly shifted their attention to other pursuits by mid-November, and the weekday timing eliminates the weekend traffic that persists even into the colder months. I wanted the trail to myself because I had a specific photographic project in mind. I had been working on a series of images from this particular trail across the seasons, documenting the same locations in different light and weather conditions over the course of a year, and the November morning light on the open summit meadow was something I had not yet captured and had been waiting for the right conditions to attempt. The conditions that morning were close to ideal overcast. The flat, diffused light that photographers prefer for the kind of saturated color work I was doing, the November grasses on the summit meadow, the specific gold brown that they reach in the weeks before the first frost. I parked at the lot at the trail's base at about 8 in the morning and began my ascent. The trail is approximately 4 miles round trip with about 1,000 feet of elevation gain, which at my pace means a comfortable 2 hours up and a bit less coming down. I was carrying my full camera pack, which adds weight but which I am accustomed to on this trail, and I moved at the pace that a familiar trail and a loaded pack together produce, which is unhurried and attentive to the terrain rather than focused on covering miles quickly. The lower section of the trail runs through second-growth hardwood forest that in November is at the very end of its color. Most of the leaves had fallen, and those remaining on the trees were the late-staying oaks and beeches, brown and dry and rattling in the light wind that moved through the canopy. The trail surface was covered in the fallen leaves of the past several weeks, a layer 2 to 3 inches deep in most sections. The leaves dry enough from the recent absence of rain to produce the specific crisp sound of walking through an uncompressed fall layer. I was approximately 2 miles from the summit, in the section of trail that runs through a dense stand of young hardwoods before opening into the upper meadow approach, when I became aware of the sound behind me. I want to be careful about how I describe it because the description matters, and I have spent time thinking about how to be precise. It was not footsteps. I know what footsteps sound like on a leaf-covered trail because I had been listening to my own footsteps for the previous hour and a half, and the sound is specific. The compression of the leaf layer, the slight crunch of individual leaves breaking under the weight of a foot, the shuffle of leaves displacing ahead of the foot as it lands. What I heard behind me had the rhythm of footsteps, the timing, the spacing, the general cadence of walking, but the quality was wrong. The sound was slightly off from what feet on leaves produce, as though something was producing a sound that approximated footsteps without exactly replicating them. A very close imitation that was missing some element I could identify by its absence, but not by its presence. I turned around. The trail behind me was empty as far as I could see, which in that section was perhaps 40 feet before a curve in the trail blocked the view. I stood and looked at the empty trail for perhaps 10 seconds and heard nothing. I turned and continued walking, and the sound resumed behind me within perhaps 15 seconds of my resuming. Not instantly, not the immediate resumption of something that had been waiting for me to start moving, but the slightly delayed resumption that I had noticed in the earlier description, and that had the quality of continuation rather than reaction, as though it had paused when I paused and was now continuing its own forward movement as I continued mine. I turned around several more times on the ascent and got the same result each time: empty trail, silence while I was stopped, resumption when I began walking. I reached the summit after what seemed like a longer climb than usual, though my watch showed a normal time, and I spent about 40 minutes on the meadow doing the photography I had come for. The summit was empty of other people, as I had expected, and while I was there I heard nothing behind me, which I noted as a change from the lower trail, but did not invest with particular significance. The open meadow is a different acoustic environment from the forested lower section, and something that had been audible in the forest might not be audible in the open. I photographed what I had come to photograph and I started down. The sound was behind me within the first quarter mile of the descent. Before I had re-entered the forest section, which surprised me because I had expected it to return when I was back under the canopy where the acoustics would support it. But there it was on the open upper trail, the same wrong rhythm sound at the same distance behind me, and I turned, and the trail was empty, as it had been on the ascent, and the sound stopped when I stopped and resumed when I resumed. I descended with it behind me for the full descent, which took approximately an hour and 40 minutes, and I turned around perhaps 8 times, and each time the result was the same. The clay sections are what I want to tell you about, because the clay sections are the factual part of the account that I can point to, and that cannot be explained by anything I have been able to think of in the months since the hike. The Bear Wallow Trail passes through 2 sections, where the soil changes character, where the leaf-covered forest floor gives way to exposed red clay that has been worn to a smooth surface by the passage of feet over years, and that in the dry November conditions I was hiking in had a surface, somewhere between firm and soft. Firm enough to walk on without sinking significantly, but soft enough to accept and retain a footprint impression. I know these sections well from years of hiking the trail, and I pay attention to them because clay trails can be treacherous when wet, and I always assess their condition. The first clay section was about a mile from the trailhead on the descent. I was in the section of perhaps 30 feet of exposed clay, moving carefully because the surface was dry enough that the compression under my boot was giving me good grip, but I was not rushing. As I crossed, I could hear my own footsteps differently on the clay. The sound my boots made was different from the leaf sound I had been hearing, a duller impact, the clay absorbing the contact differently. I crossed to the far edge of the clay section, and I looked back at it, and I saw my ascending footprints from the morning clear impressions of my boot soles in the clay, the tread pattern distinct, the depth consistent with my pack weight bearing down on each step. Beside them, my descending footprints, fresh, same boot, same depth. The section behind my descending footprints, the section between my most recent footprint and the far edge of the clay from which I had entered, showed nothing. Not the lighter impression of something smaller than me. Not a different tread pattern. Not the slight compression of a weight that had crossed the clay, without leaving a full impression. The clay behind my footprints was smooth and unmarked, and showed only the minor texturing of a surface that had been dried by recent good weather. I crouched at the edge of the clay and I pressed my finger into it, and it left a clear mark. The clay was soft enough to accept and retain any impression. I walked back through the clay to the far edge and returned, making a clear track, and the difference between the marked surface and the unmarked surface was unambiguous. Nothing had crossed that clay behind me. I stood at the edge of the first clay section for a long time, long enough that the shadow from a tree at the trail edge had moved perceptibly by the time I started walking again. I was trying to hold 2 things simultaneously that could not be held simultaneously. The sound that had been behind me for hours, which was real, which I had heard with the clarity of a person who knows what sounds a trail makes and can identify a departure from those sounds, and the clay that showed nothing, which was also real, which I could see and touch and measure with the mark of my own finger. Real and incompatible, and the incompatibility was the specific quality of wrongness that I am still sitting with. The second clay section, about half a mile further down the trail, produced the same result. My ascending prints, my descending prints, the section behind my descending prints unmarked and smooth. I did not stop as long at the second section. I had already processed what I was looking at, and the second section simply confirmed the first, and I walked the remaining half mile to the trailhead with the sound behind me, at its consistent wrong rhythm and its consistent distance. And I reached the trailhead, and I got in my car, and I sat there. I sat in the car for about 20 minutes. I ate the last of my food and drank water, and I did not look at the trailhead or the trail entrance, which I am aware is itself a kind of information about my state of mind at that point. I started the engine and drove home, and I processed the photographs that evening. And the photographs were good. The November summit light, exactly what I had hoped for. The grass color and the diffused sky and the framing of the distant ridges, all working the way I had wanted them to work. I looked at the photographs for a long time, and I thought about the clay sections and the sound and the empty trail each time I turned around. And I have thought about them many times since, and I have not been back to Bear Wallow. I want to be careful not to claim more than I know. I know I heard a sound. I know the sound had the rhythm of footsteps without the quality of footsteps. I know the clay sections showed only my own prints, I do not know what produced the sound. I do not know why it had the specific wrong quality that distinguished it from ordinary footsteps on a leaf-covered trail, the quality that made it feel like an approximation of footsteps rather than footsteps themselves, as though whatever was making the sound was producing the form of walking without the substance of it, the pattern without the weight. I have thought about this specific quality often, the difference between the form and the substance, and I find that thinking about it closely produces a discomfort that thinking about the clay sections alone does not produce. The clay sections are a factual mystery, something left no mark where a mark should have been. The wrong quality of the sound is something else, something harder to sit with, because it implies intention in a way that an absence of marks does not. The clay just shows nothing. The sound was trying to sound like something it was not. Those are different problems, and I do not know which one disturbs me more on the nights when both of them are present and the November forest outside my window is doing what November forests do, which is to stand in the dark and hold whatever they hold and show nothing. My son Eli was 14 when we did the Big Creek Loop, and I want to tell you that the trip was his idea as much as mine, which matters because I have thought sometimes in the year since about whether I should have taken him somewhere more traveled, somewhere with less of the specific remoteness that the Big Creek area of the Smokies produces when you get a day or two from the trailhead. But the remoteness was part of what we were after. Eli is not a child who finds comfort in crowds, and the trip was meant to be something that was ours, a shared experience built on the kind of effort and attention that remote backcountry requires, the kind of experience that becomes part of how two people understand their relationship when they look back on it. I had been planning a trip like this with him for years, waiting until he was old enough and capable enough to handle 3 days of real backcountry, and at 14 he was both. He is a capable, observant kid with good judgment, which is relevant to the account because what I am going to tell you involves his observation as much as mine, and I want you to understand that his observation is worth the same weight as any adult's. The Big Creek area in the northeastern corner of Great Smoky Mountains National Park is one of the less visited sections of the park, which in a park that sees millions of visitors per year is still a relative description. There are people on the Big Creek Trail, but fewer of them, and the campsites further into the loop fill less reliably than the sites near the more accessible parts of the park. We had the permit system to thank for knowing our campsites would be available, and we had planned a 3-day loop that would take us from the Big Creek trailhead up through the drainage and across a ridgeline and back down through a different drainage, covering about 25 miles total over 3 days. I had done sections of this loop before, and I knew the terrain was demanding but manageable for a fit teenager who had been training specifically for the trip. Eli had been training. He was ready. The first day went exactly as I had hoped. Good miles, good conversation, the kind of hiking day that produces the specific tiredness that leads to deep sleep and the specific satisfaction that comes from covering difficult terrain under your own power with someone you love. We camped at our designated site on Big Creek, cooked and ate and talked and went to sleep at 9, and I slept better than I sleep most nights at home. The second day began the same way, early start. Good light through the forest canopy, the trail climbing steadily toward the ridgeline that the loop crosses before descending into the second drainage. Eli was moving well, and his mood was good, and we were talking about something I no longer remember the specifics of when he said, quietly and without alarm, that there was something moving uphill of us. I want to describe the moment carefully because the absence of alarm and how he said it is part of what I remember most clearly. He did not stop. He did not grab my arm. He said it the way you say something when you have noticed something that you want to share with the person you are with, conversationally, and it was only after I looked uphill and saw what he was seeing that I understood the thing he had been calm about was not a small thing. On the uphill side of the trail, at a distance I estimated as 40 feet, or slightly more, in the dense mixed hardwood and hemlock forest that lined the slope above us, there was movement, not the movement of leaves in wind. There was no significant wind at that point in the day, and not the movement of a bird through the canopy, which I can identify readily enough from the small scale and the discontinuous quality of it. This was larger movement, lower in the forest structure, in the understory rather than the canopy, and it was tracking our lateral movement along the trail in the way I recognized immediately, because it was the same way that I recognized a moving vehicle, keeping pace with a walking person from across a field. The movement was going in our direction at our speed. I told Eli to keep walking at our normal pace and to look forward, not uphill. I was managing my own response, and I was managing his simultaneously, which is what being a parent in a difficult situation on a trail requires, and I am aware that this management was doing some of the work that acknowledgement should have been doing, and that this was probably not the right choice, but it was the choice I made. We walked for perhaps another 2 minutes, and I watched the uphill movement in my peripheral vision, and it continued at the same distance and the same pace. Then I said to Eli, "Let's stop for a water break." We stopped. The movement uphill stopped. I drank from my bottle, and Eli drank from his, and we stood on the trail, and the forest on the uphill side was still. Completely still, in the way that a forest is still when there is genuinely nothing moving in it, the absence of the movement as distinct as the movement had been. After perhaps 30 seconds, I said, "Let's keep going." We started walking. The movement on the uphill side resumed within perhaps 15 seconds. Eli said, "It stopped when we stopped." I said, "I know." He said, "Is it a bear?" I said, "I don't know." I said this honestly because at that point I genuinely did not know, and I was not going to tell my son something I did not know to be true. We went through the test several more times, stopping and starting, watching the uphill side stop and start with us, and by the third test I had stopped being able to maintain the working hypothesis that it was a bear, because bears do not track parallel to hikers at a consistent distance over extended time in the way that we were observing. Bears investigate. Bears approach or depart. They do not maintain a 40-foot parallel at matching pace for what was at that point approaching an hour of hiking. We were not being tracked by a bear in any behavioral pattern I recognized as bearish. I want to be honest about what I said to Eli and what I did not say. I said that whatever was moving uphill of us appeared to be moving with us, and that we were going to keep moving at our normal pace and make noise as we went, which is standard bear country protocol, and which I applied here because it was the most relevant available framework, even if I was not certain it fit. I did not say that I could not identify what I was looking at. I did not say that the specific quality of the movement, fluid, consistent, maintaining a precise distance across varied terrain, was not something I could account for. I was managing Eli's experience as much as I was managing my own, and I did not think that the full weight of my uncertainty would be useful to him at that moment. I think now, a year later, that he had reached the full weight of his own uncertainty and did not need me to add to it, and that my management was more for me than for him, and that he knew this. The first seep section was approximately 2 miles after we first noticed the movement. Spring seeps in the Smokies saturate the trail soil in a characteristic way that turns a section of trail that looks ordinary from a distance into a section where every step sinks, the soil holding moisture from the constant slow flow of groundwater that seeps from the slope above. The section we encountered was perhaps 20 feet of trail that had been thoroughly saturated by a seep on the uphill side. The soil, the color, and consistency of chocolate pudding, the surface showing the impressions of every boot that had crossed it in recent days. I went first, and my boots sank approximately an inch with each step, the impressions left behind deep and clean with the tread pattern of my hiking boots clearly legible in the mud. Eli followed me and his impressions were there too, slightly lighter than mine given the difference in our weights. We crossed and I turned around and looked back at the seep section, and I looked at the uphill edge of the trail, where the seep's moisture extended off the trail onto the slope, and I looked at the soil there. The soil on the uphill side of the trail was undisturbed, not showing the lighter impression of something smaller or lighter than us, not showing a distorted impression of something that had moved carefully to minimize contact. Undisturbed, in the specific way of saturated soil that has not been walked on smooth, with the slight surface sheen of waterlogged ground, and the integrity of a surface that has not been compressed or displaced. The movement on the uphill side had been at a consistent 40 feet from the trail. At 40 feet from the trail, on a slope covered in the same saturated soil as the trail surface, something moving at our pace and our weight class would have sunk into the ground with every step. There were no steps. There was nothing in the soil on the uphill side. I did not say anything to Eli about this. I turned back to the trail and kept walking, and Eli was behind me, and the movement on the uphill side resumed, and I walked for perhaps another mile before I found a flat section of trail where we could stop for lunch and where I could sit. facing the uphill slope and watch it while we ate. We ate in relative quiet, the conversation less easy than it had been in the morning, and I watched the uphill forest and saw nothing move. The movement had apparently ceased when we stopped, as it had ceased each time we stopped, and in the still forest there was nothing to look at. Eli sat across from me and I could see him looking at the uphill forest too, in the way that 14-year-olds look at things they are trying to appear not to look at. The second seep section was about a mile after lunch and produced the same result. My footprints and Eli's footprints in the saturated soil of the trail, and the uphill edge of the trail and the slope above it undisturbed. Nothing in the soil that should have shown something if something was there. I stood at the edge of the second seep for a long time, and I pressed my hand flat against the soil on the uphill side, and felt it give under the pressure of my hand, felt it accept the impression of my palm and fingers. And I lifted my hand and looked at the clear mark it had left, and I looked at the surrounding soil that showed nothing. And I put my pack back on and kept walking. We finished the loop in a day and a half, rather than the planned 3 days. I told Eli we were making good time, and that finishing early would give us the option of a real meal and a bed, which was true, and which was also not the full reason we were moving as fast as we were moving. He did not push back on this. He moved fast with me, and we came off the trail in the early afternoon of the third day rather than the late afternoon, and we drove to Gatlinburg and ate at a restaurant and sat across from each other over food that was significantly better than anything we had been eating for 3 days. And Eli said, "Dad, do you know what that was?" I said, "No." He said, "Me neither." And then we talked about something else, and we have talked about something else ever since, on the occasions when the Big Creek trip has come up in conversation with him. We talk about the camp on the first night and the quality of the light on the ridgeline crossing and the restaurant in Gatlinburg, and we do not talk about the second day and the movement on the uphill side and the 2 seep sections, what the soil showed in both of them. I told my brother the full account, and he believed me immediately and completely and did not ask follow-up questions, which is the response of someone who has his own account he has never fully told, though I have not asked him and he has not offered it. Eli is 15 now. He has been on 3 backpacking trips since the Big Creek Loop, and he is still a person who wants to be in the backcountry, which tells me something about what the second day did to him that I find both reassuring and somewhat more complex than reassuring. He has not said he wants to go back to the Smokies. I have not suggested it. The Smokies are there, and the Big Creek Loop is there, and the uphill slope on the second day of that loop is there with whatever moved along it at 40 feet for hours, and left nothing in the saturated soil of 2 spring seeps. And I think about the seep soil most, the specific saturated consistency of it, the way my hand left a clear impression when I pressed it flat against the surface, the way the surrounding soil showed nothing, despite the movement that had been there. The soil records weight. The soil recorded us. The soil recorded the raccoon prints and the deer prints that crossed the trail in other sections. The soil did not record what walked uphill of us for most of the second day of a trip I planned for a year to give my son something we could share, and we share it, but not in the way I planned, and I am not certain which of us is carrying the heavier part of it. I have been a wildlife biologist for 16 years, and I want to say at the outset that this account is not something I have submitted in any professional capacity and is not something I intend to submit, and that the decision not to submit it is not the decision of a person who lacks confidence in her own observations, but the decision of a person who understands exactly what would happen to those observations in a professional context and has chosen to protect her credibility by keeping them out of that context. I am telling it here because I think the record should exist somewhere, and because I have been carrying it for 8 months, and because the carrying has become its own problem that the telling might address in some small way. I do not expect to be believed without reservation. I expect to be received with the skepticism that this kind of account reasonably produces in people who have not experienced something similar. What I ask is that the skepticism be applied to the explanation rather than to the observation, because the observation is precise and professional and produced by someone who has spent 16 years training herself to observe accurately and record what she observes without the overlay of interpretation or expectation. I observed what I observed. The interpretation is where I have no ground to stand on, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The wildlife management area where I do most of my field work is in eastern Kentucky, in a section of the Daniel Boone National Forest that the state has designated for managed wildlife use, and I have been working in that specific area for 6 of my 16 years. I know it well in the professional sense. I know the species assemblage, the habitat characteristics, the seasonal patterns of the wildlife I monitor, the trail system and the off-trail terrain, and the way the area's topography shapes animal movement and distribution. I also know it in the more personal sense that comes from spending hundreds of days in a place across multiple years, from knowing its sounds and its light and its seasonal character with the familiarity that extended presence produces. This familiarity is relevant to what I am going to tell you because it means that what I noticed on the day in question was noticeable precisely because it did not fit what I knew. I was not in unfamiliar terrain producing strange observations. I was in thoroughly familiar terrain producing an observation that had no place in my knowledge of that terrain. The day was a Wednesday in late March. I had been in the field the previous day as well, conducting bird point counts in the area's upland sections, and I had planned the Wednesday for mammal transect work on the trail system that runs through the lower elevation forest sections. An overnight rain had left conditions that I noted in my field log as excellent for tracking. The trail surface was saturated to a uniform soft mud that would record any passage with high fidelity, and the forest floor off the trail was similarly saturated, the leaf litter pressed flat and wet, and the soil beneath it soft enough to accept and hold impressions. I have worked in these conditions many times, and I appreciate them because they produce a detailed record of animal activity that dry conditions do not. I was looking forward to the day's work. I started my first transect at about 7:30, and the first 2 hours were productive in the ordinary way. The mud on the trail surface was the perfect tracking medium I had anticipated, and it was covered in the overnight and morning activity of the area's wildlife. White-tailed deer tracks in the soft sections, heavy and clear, with the characteristic dew-claw impressions of adults moving at a walk, raccoon tracks at every wet section, and creek crossing, their distinctive hand-like prints, often overlapping and hard to count individually. Wild turkey tracks in several sections, the three-toed pattern unmistakable, a dog print that I identified as domestic from its size and the regularity of its gait pattern, probably from one of the farms at the area's edge. I noted all of these in my field log with the standard notation I use for transect work species, direction of travel, estimated time of passage based on the track's condition relative to the rain cessation. Good data, the kind of morning that makes you feel the fieldwork is working the way fieldwork is supposed to work. I was on the third transect section, in the lower elevation forest where the creek drainage produces the densest canopy and the most complex understory, when I noticed the movement on my left side. It was approximately 1 in the afternoon. I had stopped to record a set of deer tracks at a creek crossing, and I was crouching over the tracks making my notations, when I heard something move in the forest on my left side, at a distance I estimated as 20 to 25 feet. A single movement, the sound of displacement in wet leaf litter, not a branch snap, not the definitive crack of something breaking, but the softer sound of leaves, compressing under weight, and then releasing as the weight shifted. I looked in the direction of the sound and saw nothing, which is normal. Most wildlife movement in dense forest is heard before it is seen, and often is only heard, the visual concealment of the understory preventing direct observation. I finished my notation and stood and resumed walking my transect. The movement on my left side resumed approximately 20 seconds after I started walking. Consistent with my pace, maintaining approximately the same distance, the sound of wet leaf litter compressing under weight at the rhythm of something walking. I have spent 16 years listening to animals move through forest, and I have a well-developed catalog of what different animals sound like at different gaits and different conditions. This sounded like a mammal of moderate to large size. The weight implied by the compression of the wet leaves was more than a raccoon or a small dog, more consistent with a deer or a large dog, or possibly a coyote on the large end of the scale. This categorization felt reasonable, and I continued my transect work with the awareness on my left side that I always maintain when wildlife is present and moving in my proximity, which is an ordinary professional condition. I stopped at the next tracking station to record some raccoon prints, and the movement on my left stopped. I noted this absently. Wildlife often stops when a human observer stops, the animal pausing to assess whether the human has detected it. I finished my recording and resumed walking, and the movement resumed. I stopped twice more in the next quarter mile to record tracks, and each time the movement on my left stopped when I stopped and resumed when I resumed. And by the second instance, I had shifted my attention from the tracking data to the movement itself. The consistency of it, the precise pace matching, the consistent distance, the clean stop and start synchronized with my own, was more regular than the behavior of a wary animal in proximity to a human typically produces. A wary deer or coyote stops when you stop, but resumes based on its own assessment of the situation, not necessarily when you start moving again. This resumption was too closely synchronized with mine to fit the behavioral pattern of an animal managing its relationship to a human observer. I stopped and stood still for a long time, perhaps 3 minutes, and heard nothing. The forest on my left was silent in the way of a forest in which whatever was there had also stopped and was waiting. I started walking at about half my normal pace. The movement resumed at half pace. I increased to a brisk walk. The movement increased. I decreased back to a slow walk. The movement decreased. I was now conducting a deliberate behavioral test rather than a transect, which is a departure from my field protocol that I made consciously and that I recorded in my field log as a departure with the specific reason noted. Anomalous following behavior. Testing pace response. The test was unambiguous. Whatever was moving on my left side was matching my pace with the precision of something that was either aware of my pace before I changed it, anticipating rather than reacting, or was capable of reacting to pace changes with a latency too short to measure in the field. Either interpretation was inconsistent with any wildlife behavior, in my professional knowledge. Animals that follow humans in parallel do so for various reasons: curiosity, territorial monitoring, learned behavior around food sources, and in none of these cases does the following behavior include precise pace matching across multiple pace changes over an extended period. What I was observing was not a behavioral pattern that belongs to any native wildlife species in eastern Kentucky. I knew this with professional confidence, and I continued my transect while knowing it, which is the decision of a scientist who is committed to a day's fieldwork and is not going to abandon it because of something she cannot yet explain. The mud sections are the part of the account that I have thought about most and that I want to describe with the precision they deserve. The trail system in the creek drainage crosses 3 sections of trail where the soil saturation is extreme, where the creek's influence on the surrounding terrain produces a mud surface that extends off the trail onto the process. Adjacent forest floor for 10 to 15 feet on each side before the terrain rises enough to drain. These sections are the best tracking stations on the transect system, and I always spend additional time at them because the record they hold is comprehensive and detailed. I reached the first of these sections mid-afternoon, with the movement on my left side continuing at its consistent 20 to 25 feet. I crossed the mud section, and I turned, and I looked at it. My tracks were there, deep, clear, the lugged sole of my field boots printed in high fidelity in the mud, the impressions approximately 3/4 of an inch deep, given my weight and the soil's saturation. I know how deep impressions should be in mud of this consistency, and my impressions were exactly what I expected. I looked at the left side of the trail, between my tracks and the point 20 to 25 feet into the forest where the movement had been coming from. The mud surface was undisturbed, not showing the lighter impressions of something smaller or lighter, not showing any compression at any point across the full width of the saturated section. Undisturbed, with the intact surface texture of mud that has received rain and settled and has not been subsequently walked on. I have a professional reflex when I encounter an unexpected tracking result, which is to verify the medium's recording capacity before concluding that nothing passed through it. I pressed my finger into the mud surface on the undisturbed section. The impression was immediate and clear, deeper than my boot impressions because my finger was applying more concentrated pressure, but the depth and clarity demonstrated conclusively that the mud would have recorded any passage by any animal with any weight above that of a small bird. I pressed my boot into the undisturbed section, and the impression was identical to my crossing tracks. The mud was recording everything. It had not recorded whatever was moving on my left side. I reached the second and third mud sections later in the afternoon and conducted the same observation at each one. The results were the same. my tracks clear and deep, the left side of the trail undisturbed, the mud demonstrably capable of recording any passage. Nothing recorded on the left side despite hours of audible movement at a distance where something of the size implied by the sound would have crossed the mud sections and left clear evidence of its passage. I have 16 years of professional track reading, and I understand what the mud was telling me. The mud was telling me that nothing had been there. The sound had been telling me something had been there for most of the afternoon. These two things were in direct contradiction, and I had the professional evidence for both of them in my field log. I completed my transects. I am a professional, and I completed my field work, which required approximately another hour of walking after the third mud section, and the movement on my left side continued for most of that hour before the trail climbed out of the creek drainage and the character of the forest changed and the movement ceased. It ceased in the way that sounds cease when their source has stopped, not in the way that sounds cease when you move out of hearing range, a clean stop rather than a gradual fade. And after the cessation, the forest was simply the forest. The late afternoon sounds of the bird species present in that habitat at that time of year, the wind in the upper canopy, the ordinary acoustic environment of a place I know well. I drove back to my office, and I transcribed my field notes, and I thought about what to include and what not to include. And I made the decision that I have described no professional report, no discussion with colleagues, no record in any document that would be reviewed by anyone who might reasonably question my professional judgment. I included the tracking data and the species observations and the habitat condition notes. I did not include the movement or the mud sections or the behavioral test and its results. I filed the report and I went home, and I submitted a formal request for reassignment to a different management area within the week, citing professional reasons that were true and that were also not the primary reason. And the reassignment was approved, and I have been working in a different area since. The management area where the field work occurred is still there, and other biologists work in it, and I have no reason to think they are having experiences similar to mine or any reason to think they are not, because the one thing I know for certain about what I heard and what the mud showed me is that I have no framework for it and no category for it, and 16 years of professional training did not prepare me for it, and the mud was a perfect recording medium, and the mud showed nothing, and the movement was there, and the mud showed nothing, and I have no report to file. My husband Robert and I retired within 6 months of each other 3 years ago, and we made a list. In the month after his retirement, when we first had the time and the freedom to think clearly about what we wanted the next years to look like, of the things we had been saying we would do when we had the time. The list was longer than either of us expected and contained more overlap between our individual lists than we had anticipated, which was reassuring in the way that discovering your partner wants the same things you want is always reassuring, even after 31 years of marriage when you thought you already knew. Near the top of both of our lists, in slightly different language that meant the same thing, was walking. Specifically, walking in the mountains of western North Carolina, which we had been visiting for weekends and short vacations across our marriage but had never had the time to do properly, with the days and the miles and the pace that doing something properly requires. We started working through the trail systems of the western North Carolina mountains in the first year after Robert's retirement, and we have kept at it since, and the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail was one of the trails on our extended list. I want to tell you about the Overmountain Victory Trail, because its character is relevant to what happened on it. The trail follows, as closely as the modern landscape permits, the route taken by the Overmountain men in the autumn of 1780 on their way to the Battle of Kings Mountain, through the mountain terrain of western North Carolina and Tennessee, and into South Carolina, through gaps and over ridges and down hollows that the 18th century travelers crossed under conditions I think about every time I walk the trail. It is a trail with historical weight, which is a quality that I find affects how you experience the walking. You are aware, on this trail more than on others, of the accumulated passage of the people who came before you and the specific purposes that brought them through this terrain at this moment in history. Robert feels this too. We have talked about it on multiple sections of the trail that we have completed together, the quality of presence that historical weight lends to a trail that less storied paths do not have. I mention this because I have wondered, in the months since the day I am going to describe, Whether the trail's particular quality of presence, the sense of being in a place where many people have walked with intent and purpose is part of what happened, or whether it is simply the story I tell myself to give what happened a container it does not deserve. We were hiking a section in western North Carolina on a day in late October, the second day of a weekend trip that had been planned around the weather forecast and the leaf color, both of which were cooperating. The trail in that section moves through a combination of forested terrain and open ridge walking, and the late October conditions in western North Carolina produce a specific visual character: the hardwoods at their late color, the understory visible through the thinning leaves, the light at a low enough angle to make the forest interior luminous in the afternoon hours. Robert is a photographer, was a professional photographer before his retirement, and remains one in practice, if not in occupation. And the afternoon light on this particular section was producing the kind of material he responds to, which means he was stopping frequently to set up shots, and that our pace was irregular in the way that hiking with a photographer makes pace irregular. We had been on the trail for about 3 hours when we reached a section of forested descent, where the trail dropped through a stand of large hardwoods toward a stream crossing before climbing again. I was moving comfortably, and Robert had stopped perhaps 100 yards back to photograph a view through a gap in the trees, where the ridge we had descended was visible against the afternoon sky. I had waited twice already for him to complete similar photographs, and I was in the mood to keep moving, which he understood, and we had an understanding on these walks that if I moved ahead he would catch up at whatever natural stopping point was ahead. I moved ahead. The forested section was perhaps a quarter-mile long between where I left Robert and the small clearing beside the stream crossing where I planned to wait. The trail in this section was the kind of trail that the mountains of western North Carolina produce in late October, covered in fresh fallen leaves, the surface soft from the weight of the leaf layer, the light coming through the thinning canopy at the low angle that makes the forest glow. I was moving at a comfortable walk, not hurrying, paying attention to the trail surface and the forest around me in the way that I have learned to pay attention after 3 years of making these walks a serious part of my life. I was about 2 minutes into the forested section when I heard Robert behind me. I heard him clearly and without ambiguity, or I thought I heard him, which is the distinction that the subsequent facts forced me to make, but that was not available to me at the time. What I heard was the sound of someone walking on the leaf-covered trail at a distance of perhaps 30 to 40 feet behind me. Not a single sound, not the occasional sound of someone moving through an area, a continuous, consistent sound of walking, the compression and displacement of the leaf layer under each step, rhythmic and regular, and at a pace slightly slower than mine, which is consistent with Robert's pace relative to mine because I typically move a little faster than he does when we are hiking, and he catches up to me rather than my slowing to match him. I did not turn around. I had no reason to turn around. Robert was behind me, I assumed, having completed his photograph and begun the descent to catch up to me, and the sound of his footsteps on the leaf-covered trail was exactly the sound I would have expected to hear under those circumstances. I walked the full quarter-mile to the clearing with the sound behind me the whole way. It maintained its distance. The 30 to 40 feet did not close as the walk continued, which I noticed but attributed to Robert's pace being what it usually is, comfortable rather than hurrying. The sound was clear and present for the entire walk, and I was aware of it in the way you are aware of another person walking behind you on a trail, not alarmed, not paying acute attention, simply aware of the presence as part of the experience of sharing the trail with someone. I reached the clearing and the stream crossing, and I stepped off the trail into the clearing and turned around to wait for Robert to emerge from the forest. The trail emerging from the trees in the clearing was empty. I watched it for perhaps a minute and nothing came out of the forest. I turned and looked at the stream and thought about the photograph he had been taking and how long his photographs sometimes took when the light was doing something specific, and I looked back at the trail entrance and the trail was still empty. After another minute or so, Robert emerged from the forest at a comfortable walk, without the hurry of someone who has been rushing to catch up, and he came into the clearing and we said hello. And he made a comment about the light in the forest section being even better than the view he had stopped for, and I said that I had heard him coming the whole way. And he said, "What do you mean you heard me coming?" And I said, "I heard your footsteps behind me the whole way through the forest section." And he said he had stopped for 2 photographs and had taken his time and had been by himself the whole walk. Down, we looked at each other across the small clearing. We are people who have been married for 31 years, and we communicate a great deal in silence. And in the look we exchanged in that clearing, there was the full weight of what I had just told him, and what he had just told me, and neither of us had words for it immediately. The stream ran between us and the clearing and the forest on the uphill side, and the afternoon light was doing what the afternoon light in those mountains does in late October, which is to be extraordinary and indifferent, and we stood with the ordinary beauty of the place, and the thing that we could not explain, and we did not say anything for a moment. Then Robert, because he is a practical man who is also a careful man, walked back to where the trail entered the clearing, and he looked at the trail surface, and he waved me over. The trail at the clearing's edge passed through a section of exposed red clay, the kind of clay that western North Carolina trails often surface in, where the mineral soil is close to the surface, and the foot traffic has worn away the organic layer rust red, compacted by use, but in the October conditions still soft enough to show clear impressions. The section was perhaps 20 feet long between the forest edge and the leaf-covered trail surface of the clearing itself. My footprints were there, clear and heading away from the forest, the impressions of my boots in the red clay exactly what you would expect from my weight and my pace. And behind my footprints, in the section of clay that separated the forest section from where I had been walking, the clay Robert's footprints were there too slightly larger than mine, the impressions at the spacing of his stride, his boots' tread pattern distinct in the clay. His footprints were further back on the trail, behind mine, as you would expect from someone who entered the clay section after I had left it. Between my last print and his first print, there was a section of the clay where the sound had been at its clearest. I could place it because it was the section just before the clearing, where the trail was most enclosed by the forest, and the sound had seemed closest and most present. That section of clay was undisturbed. The clay between my prints and Robert's prints, in the 20 feet where whatever had been walking behind me would have been walking when I heard it most clearly, showed the smooth and unmarked surface of clay that has not been stepped on. We looked at it together, Robert and I, and we did not need to discuss what we were looking at because we both understood immediately. My prints, his prints, the smooth, undisturbed clay between them where the sound had been. We finished the hike. We drove back to the place we were staying and we had dinner, and we drove home the following day, and we have not discussed the 20 minutes in the forested section since. Not once, in the months since that October day, have we sat down and had the conversation about what I heard and what the clay showed. I have thought about it many times by myself, in the way that you think about something that you cannot explain and that does not resolve with thinking, and I have no conclusion. I know what I heard. I know what the clay showed. I know that the sound I heard for 20 minutes on a forested section of the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail was the sound of someone walking behind me on a leaf-covered trail, and I know that the clay at the section's end showed no print between mine and Robert's. And I know that whatever made that sound, whatever walked behind me for 20 minutes through the October forest on a trail that the Overmountain men walked in 1780 and that many people have walked since, was not Robert. Beyond that, I have nothing. The trail is still there. The clay section is still there. Whatever walks on it, whether anyone is there to hear it or not, which is the thought I find most difficult to set aside, and which I carry with me from that day, and which surfaces most persistently on October afternoons, when the light in the mountains is low and luminous, and the leaves are falling, and the forest sounds the way the forest sounded when I was walking and listening, and certain that Robert was behind me. There were 4 of us, and I want to name us because making us anonymous would make the account feel less real, and the account is real. Myself, my college friend Derek, his wife Priya, and our mutual friend James, who had been talking about hiking Ramsey Cascades for 2 years, and who organized the trip, and who is the one who went back alone, and who will not tell me what happened when he did. I am telling the account of the group trip, which I was present for and which I can speak to directly. The solo trip is James's account to tell or not tell, and since he has chosen not to tell it, I am going to respect that and leave it as the fact it is. He went back alone and something happened, and he does not discuss it, and I am going to tell you what the 4 of us experienced together, which is already more than I fully know what to do with. The Ramsey Cascades Trail in the Greenbrier section of Great Smoky Mountains National Park is approximately 4 miles each way, following the Ramsey Prong of the middle prong of the Little Pigeon River through old-growth forest before climbing to the Cascades at the trail's end, which are the highest waterfall in the park and which are worth the 8-mile round trip in the way that genuinely exceptional natural features are worth significant effort. The old-growth forest on the upper section of the trail is among the most impressive forest I have seen anywhere in the eastern United States. The tulip poplars and hemlocks at dimensions that recalibrate your sense of scale. The canopy so high that the forest floor is in a different light quality from anything below the canopy. A cathedral quality that the word cathedral does not quite capture, but that is the closest available word. We had planned the trip for months, and it exceeded what we had planned for, which is not always the case, and which made the return legs experience more disorienting than it might have been in a setting that had been merely adequate. We reached the Cascades a little after noon, and we spent about 45 minutes there eating our lunch and taking photographs and doing the things that four friends do when they have achieved the destination of a planned trip and have the time and the energy to fully inhabit the achievement, rather than rushing back. The weather was good late September in the Smokies, which can go either way, but on this day was cooperating. The sky clear enough that the light on the Cascades was the direct high-contrast light of full sun rather than the flat light of overcast. We were in good spirits. The hike down began in good spirits and remained in good spirits for the first 2 miles of the return, which covers the upper section of the trail through the old growth and begins the descent toward the lower forest and the trailhead. Derek noticed it first. We were approximately 2 miles from the trailhead, in the section of the trail that has come down from the old growth elevation and is moving through the lower mixed forest, and Derek slowed his pace slightly and fell in beside me, rather than walking in the single-file configuration we had been using on the narrower sections. And he said quietly that he was hearing an extra set of footsteps. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Listen." And I listened, and I heard what he was describing. We were 4 people walking in a loose group on a trail, and 4 people walking on a leaf-covered trail produce a specific collective sound, not 4 distinct sets of footsteps, because the steps overlap and blend at the pace we were walking, but a sound with a certain density and rhythm that 4 people produce rather than 3 or 2. What I heard when Derek told me to listen was a sound that was denser than 4 people, a rhythm with an additional element that was not part of the 4 of us, a presence at the back of our group that was slightly behind the rearmost of us, which was James, and that was producing footfalls with a rhythm and weight consistent with a 5th person following at a distance of, perhaps, 20 to 30 feet. I want to be precise about what I mean by consistent with, because I am aware that sounds on a trail can be ambiguous, and that the same acoustic information can support multiple interpretations. What I heard was not ambiguous in the way that I was experiencing it. It sounded like a person walking behind us on the trail. I said to Derek that I heard it too. He said good. He said he had been listening for about a minute before he mentioned it because he wanted to be sure he was hearing what he thought he was hearing. We slowed enough that Priya and James came alongside us, and in low voices, while continuing to walk, we described what we were hearing. Priya said she had been hearing it for the past few minutes and had been trying to decide if it was an echo. James listened for perhaps 30 seconds and then said, "That's not an echo." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who has made a decision about a perceptual question and is not going to revisit it, which is characteristic of James, and which I took seriously, because James is not someone who makes perceptual errors easily. He is a structural engineer, and he thinks in systems, and he is precise about what he knows and what he does not know. And he said, "That's not an echo." We stopped collectively, all 4 of us, as though the decision to stop had been made simultaneously without anyone proposing it. We turned and looked at the trail behind us. The trail was empty as far as we could see, which in that section of forest was perhaps 30 to 40 feet before the trail curved. Nothing was on the trail in the space we could see. We stood for perhaps 15 seconds, the 4 of us, in complete silence, and the forest was silent around us, in the way that a forest is silent when you have stopped moving through it and the birds have adjusted to your stillness. Then Derek said, "Let's keep walking and see if it comes back." We started walking. Within approximately 30 seconds, the sound was there again. The same density and rhythm, The same sense of an additional presence at the back of our moving group, at the same distance behind James. We went through several more stops and starts. The result was consistent each time. Sound when walking, silence when stopped, resumption within 30 seconds of resuming. We were not imagining it in isolation from each other because we were all four hearing it, and we were hearing it consistently enough that we did not need to confirm it to each other after the first two stops. We simply walked and heard it and knew we were all hearing it. The conversation between us on the final 2 miles was low and calm. The conversation of four people who are managing something together and who trust each other. And what we managed was to keep walking at a normal pace and to reach the trailhead without any of the behaviors that might have made the situation worse. No running, no shouting, no splitting up, nothing that would have introduced panic into a situation that was being handled by four adults who were choosing to handle it as calmly as possible. The mud section is the part I have thought about most and that I believe deserves the most careful description. The Ramsey Cascades Trail in its lower section passes through terrain that collects and holds runoff from the slope above, and there is a section of perhaps 40 feet of trail, beginning roughly half a mile from the trailhead, that is perpetually wet, and in the September conditions we were hiking in, had been softened to a consistent mud surface by the combination of recent rainfall and the constant seep from the uphill side. We had crossed this section on the way in that morning, and all four of us had made prints in the mud. I know this because I had noted our tracks on the way out, noting which prints were mine, and which were the others based on the size and tread pattern differences I could observe. We had been the only people on the trail that morning, and I was confident that the 4 sets of prints in the mud were ours. We reached the mud section on the return, and we crossed it. On the far side we stopped and we all four turned and looked at the mud, and we spent perhaps 2 minutes looking at it carefully. Our 4 ascending sets of prints from the morning were there, the mud having dried slightly since then, but the impressions still clear. Our 4 descending sets of prints from the current crossing were there, fresh, the mud still wet enough that the impressions were sharp-edged and dark. In the section of the mud trail where the sound of the 5th set of footsteps had been clearest, the section at the back of our group, at the distance behind James where we had been placing the sound, there was nothing. No print, not a partial impression, not a smeared surface suggesting something had moved across it lightly, not any disruption of the mud surface that could be interpreted as a footfall of any weight. The mud was smooth and undisturbed in the section where the 5th presence had been, as clearly undisturbed as the mud on the sides of the trail that no one had crossed. We looked at this for 2 minutes and we did not discuss it. Derek made a sound that was not quite a word. Priya crossed her arms. James looked at the mud for a long time with the expression of a structural engineer who has found something that does not fit the load calculations. I looked at it, and I thought about the 30 seconds of resumption after each stop, the consistent distance behind James, the density of the sound that I had been hearing for 2 miles, and I looked at the mud, and I thought, this mud would show a bird. The mud would show a field mouse. The mud would show anything that had any weight at all, and whatever had been behind us had the weight of a person, and it showed nothing. And I knew this with the clarity of looking directly at a surface that has been the best available evidence and has returned a null result for something I knew to be there. We walked the last half mile to the trailhead and drove home in 2 cars as planned. Derek and Priya in their car and James and myself in mine. And James and I drove for about 40 minutes before either of us said anything substantive. He said that he had been thinking about the mud, and I said I had too. He said he wanted to go back, and I said I thought that was a bad idea. And he said probably, and we drove the rest of the way in silence. That was 8 months ago. About 6 weeks later, James went back to Ramsey Cascades alone. He has not told me what happened, and I have asked twice, and both times he has said that it was fine, and that the hike was good, and that the old growth section is even better when you are not worried about keeping pace with a group. He has not said whether he heard anything on the return leg, and I have not asked directly because I have understood from the quality of his not telling that the direct question is one he does not want asked. What I know is that he went back and that something happened, and that it was enough to make him not want to talk about it in the specific way, that the group trip is not enough to make him not want to talk about. He will discuss the group trip. He discusses it as the thing it is, 4 people who heard something on a trail and found nothing in the mud. he will not discuss the solo trip. The distinction between those two things tells me more than I want to know and less than I need to know. And I have been living with that distinction for 6 months, and I expect I will continue to live with it. In the same way that I expect the Ramsey Cascades Trail will continue to be what it has apparently always been, a trail in old-growth forest in the Smokies that is worth the effort to reach, and that on the way back, in the lower forest section, in the sound of 4 people walking, that is sometimes the sound of 5, holds something in its mud that it refuses to show. The Black Mountain Crest Trail is not a trail that most people who hike have heard of, and the people who have heard of it tend to be the people who seek out specifically what it offers, which is remoteness and elevation, and the kind of solitude that only comes when you are on a trail that requires genuine commitment to reach, and that filters out everyone who is not prepared for what it asks of them. The crest runs along the spine of the Black Mountains in Yancey County, North Carolina, which is the highest mountain range east of the Mississippi River, and the trail that follows the crest does so at elevations between 5,000 and 6,000 feet across terrain that is exposed and demanding, and that produces, in the days and the miles on it, a quality of isolation that I have not found on any other trail in the eastern United States. I had been wanting to do the section I am describing for 2 years, waiting for the right weather window and the right physical conditioning and the right combination of available days, and when those things aligned in late September, I went. I want to establish something about myself before I tell you what happened on the second day, which is that I am not a hiker who is new to remote terrain or to the specific challenges that solo hiking above treeline in the Appalachians presents. I have been hiking seriously for 12 years and solo backpacking for 8 of those, and I have accumulated in those years a working knowledge of remote mountain terrain and its particular demands, navigating without cell service, managing weather changes that develop faster at elevation than below it, the specific psychology of solo hiking in places where you might not see another person for 2 or 3 days. I know what these conditions produce in me physically and mentally, and I have learned to distinguish between the heightened awareness that remote terrain appropriately generates and the kind of fear response that is producing information, rather than simply producing anxiety. What I felt on the second day of the Black Mountain Crest section was the second kind. It was producing information. The information was that something was below me on the slope, moving with me, and that the slope's soil was not showing it. The first day was the day I had planned for and hoped for. I started at the Bolins Creek trailhead in the early morning, climbed to the crest by mid-morning, and spent the day moving along the ridge in the specific quality of light and air that the elevation and the late September season combined to produce the sky a deep saturated blue at that height, the distant ridges visible in a clarity that lower elevations obscure, the trail surface, a mix of exposed rock and root-woven soil, and the occasional boggy section where the crest drainage collected. I saw no other person. I heard no evidence of other people. The day had the quality that I had been seeking when I planned this trip, which was the quality of being genuinely alone in a genuinely wild place, the kind of alone that requires distance from the nearest person rather than simply the absence of people in your immediate visual range. I camped at my planned site near a shelter on the crest and slept deeply, and woke at first light feeling the specific readiness that a good night at elevation produces. The second day began as the first had the crest, the sky, the clarity of the air at that height, the trail demanding enough to keep my full attention engaged. I was moving toward the northern end of the section and the trailhead where my car was parked, a descent that would take me off the crest and down through the spruce fir forest and then the hardwood forest to the lower elevation where the trailhead sat. The descent is long and in places steep, the trail dropping off the crest into terrain that changes character rapidly as you lose elevation, the high elevation spruce and fir giving way to hardwoods at around 4,000 feet, and the trail surface becoming softer as the exposed rock gives way to the forest floor's accumulated organic layer. I became aware of the sound below me at approximately 10 in the morning, when I was on the upper section of the descent, and the slope below the trail was steep spruce fir forest, dropping away to a drainage perhaps 300 feet below. The trail runs along the slope rather than directly down it. The descent is switchbacked rather than direct, and for significant sections, you are traversing the slope laterally, with steep terrain below you on one side, and the descent upper slope continuing above you on the other. It is in one of these lateral sections that I heard the movement below. I want to describe the sound precisely because the precision matters. The slope below the trail is steep enough that movement on it produces a specific kind of sound, not the sound of level ground movement, where a foot makes contact and releases without the complication of slope, but the sound of movement on angled terrain, where each step involves both contact and the prevention of sliding, where the body's weight is distributed differently, and the sound of each foot placement includes the scrape of traction seeking that steep terrain demands. I know this sound because I had been making it myself all morning on the steeper sections. What I heard below me was not that sound. It was quieter than movement on that slope should have been, with less of the traction-seeking scrape and less of the disturbance that a body moving on steep, loose-soiled forest slope should produce. Not silent, I could hear it, and it was clearly movement rather than wind or water, but quieter than the slope should have allowed for anything moving at the pace the sound implied. The pace was the first thing I noticed clearly. I was traversing the slope at my descending walk, and the sound below me was moving at the same lateral speed, not ascending, not descending, but traversing at my pace, tracking my position along the slope as I moved. I stopped, and the sound stopped. I moved, and the sound moved. I did the stop and start test that I have read about, and that every account I have encountered of this kind of experience describes. And the result was consistent. The sound below me was synchronized with my movement in the way that makes the stop and start test conclusive. It was not coincidence. It was not two independent movements that happened to be in phase. It stopped when I stopped, and resumed when I resumed. And the resumption had the slight delay that I have come to associate with these accounts from reading others. The delay of continuation rather than reaction, as though whatever was below me was pausing when I paused, and resuming when I resumed rather than reacting to my movement by stopping and starting. I spent perhaps 20 minutes in the section of trail where the sound was clearest, moving and stopping and listening and processing. I was doing this alone at approximately 4,500 feet, on a trail that I had not seen another person on in 36 hours, with no cell service and no prospect of any. And I want to be honest about what that felt like. It felt like the specific calm of having passed through the initial alarm response and come out into the place where the alarm has been processed. And what remains is clarity and a kind of cold attention to what is actually happening. I was afraid, and I was also clearly and deliberately thinking, and the thinking told me that the priority was to get down and get to the trailhead, and that the way to do that was to continue moving at my normal pace and not to do anything that would change the dynamic in ways I could not predict. The drainage crossings are the factual core of this account. The Black Mountain Crest Trail on this descent section crosses two drainage features, places where the slope's natural water flow has cut a channel down the mountain and where the trail crosses the channel at a low point. The soil on both sides of the crossing saturated by the seepage that concentrates in these channels. The soil at both crossings was the kind of wet, soft earth that I described when I said it was a perfect recording medium, not liquid mud but soft soil, saturated enough to give clearly under any weight and to retain the impression after the weight was removed. I know how to read soil like this, and I have read it my whole hiking life. At the first crossing I stopped before I crossed, and I looked at the soil on both sides of the trail, and I looked at the slope below the trail where the drainage continued down the mountain, the channel visible for perhaps 30 feet below the trail before the forest obscured it. I noted the soil conditions, crossed the drainage quickly, and on the far side I stopped and turned and looked back at the section I had just crossed. My footprints were in the crossing soil, clear and deep, the impressions of my boot soles distinct. I looked at the soil below the trail, in the channel section below the crossing where the drainage continued down the slope, the section where something moving on the slope below the trail at my lateral pace would have been when I was at the crossing. The soil was undisturbed. The channel walls and floor below the trail showed the intact surface of soil that has been wetted by seepage and has not been touched by any weight. I pressed my finger into the soil below the trail, and the impression was immediate and clear, as deep as my finger press, retaining the shape perfectly. The soil would have shown anything. I stood at the crossing for a long time. The slope below me was quiet. The movement had been below me for the past hour, and had been quiet when I was stopped. But the crossing section had been quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet at my previous stops. Quieter, as though the movement had either ceased or moved away from the immediate crossing area in a way that my other stops had not produced. I am not sure what to make of this distinction, and I do not want to make more of it than is warranted. What I know is that the soil at the drainage crossing below the trail showed nothing, and that my finger left a clear mark in it, and that a mark would have been made by any weight at all on that surface. The second drainage crossing, approximately half a mile further along the descent, produced the same result. The movement had resumed after the first crossing and had been below me for the half-mile between crossings. And at the second crossing, I conducted the same observation, my prints clear in the crossing soil, the drainage below the trail undisturbed, my finger leaving a mark in soil that would have shown anything. After the second crossing, the movement ceased and did not resume. Not gradually, the cessation was clean, the sound absent rather than fading, and when it was gone, the forest below the trail was simply the forest. The natural sounds of the slope and the wind and the spruce branches and the distant sound of the creek in the drainage below. I reached the trailhead in the early afternoon, and I got in my car, and I drove to Burnsville, and I checked into a motel. I had planned to drive home that evening. My car was at the southern trailhead, and I had my shuttle arranged, and I had planned to be home by 9 or 10. I did not drive home. I ate at a diner in Burnsville, and I went back to the motel, and I slept for 11 hours, and in the morning I felt ready to drive, and I drove home. I stayed the extra day not because I was unable to drive, but because I needed the night of sleep and the morning of ordinary life before I put myself back behind the wheel for a 4-hour drive, and I was willing to acknowledge this need and act on it, which is itself something I feel is worth noting. I am not someone who typically acknowledges limits that easily. I have told this account to 2 people. Both of them have had similar experiences on remote trails. Neither of them asked for clarification or expressed skepticism or offered alternative explanations. Both of them listened and said some version of, "I know," and we moved on to other things. This is the response I find helpful, and the response I have not found from people who have not had similar experiences, who tend to offer the explanations that the account does not support wind, echo, deer, dogs, my own fear creating perception where there was none. I understand why people offer these explanations, and I do not find them adequate. And I do not have the energy to explain why they are not adequate to people who have decided before listening that an adequate explanation must exist. What I have instead is the drainage crossings and the soil and my finger pressing into it and leaving a clear mark and the undisturbed surface beside my mark where the movement had been. That is what I have, and that is what I am left with. And the Black Mountain crest is still there above Yancey County at its elevation and its remoteness, and whatever traverses the slope below the trail, when someone is traversing the trail above it, is still there too, matching the pace of whoever walks above it, silent in the drainage crossings, leaving nothing in the soil that a finger press shows will hold anything at all.